I think that Mr. Henderson is evident to me, or an image of him. Mr. Henderson, there's a couple of bottles on the desk in front of you. If you feel like passing them to one side so that they don't obstruct the image of you, that'd be good. Do you see a couple of bottles there?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Mr. Henderson. Thank you very much for lodging a submission, and thank you particularly for making a recommendation that we would have a look at the book. And as you can see, we have the book and we have read it, and a very handsome book it is too. Thank you for mentioning it.
No trouble.
Now, Mr. Henderson, you've gone to the trouble of writing a handwritten submission of your own notes, and then you've attached the requests that you and some others are making for amendments to the plan change. So we've got all of that in front of us, and so this is your opportunity to speak to that in your own words and as you would like.
Thank you. You ready to start now?
Yes, whenever you are.
Right. Well, I thought for a start I'd just do a bit of dam history. The Opihi Dam near Fairlie is now 22 years old, holds 74 million cubic metres of water, stores that, 335 hectares of water lake, irrigates 16,000 hectares of various parts of South Canterbury and about 250 farmers. Maintains minimum flows, and in the Opihi River supplies water to TDC and generates 7 megawatts of power. And it was built because South Canterbury had the right people in the right place at the right time. And I certainly respect all that effort that went into it at the time. So that's just up at Fairlie. So if ever you're anywhere up there, you know where to go and have a look at it. My appointment at the Pleasant Point Town Hall with 400 people from all around South Canterbury, extremely worried about what could be done to help in what was a very serious drought in our region. There was no water at all in the Opihi catchment and riverbeds. This would be 1980 and was the third year in a row that made the event serious, and all farmers and others were extremely worried. This meeting nominated me to do something about getting a solution, and I presented a proposal that we should try to get water from Lake Tekapo, but the principle of getting it from a storage place to give us reliability and keep the river flowing and reliable water for the irrigators is the key to irrigation, is to having reliable water. I formed a group called the Opihi River Augmentation Society. Anyone interested were invited and welcome to get involved. That team, representatives from all over South Canterbury, included farmers, fishermen, business people looking to the future. The result was that we got a consent to take water from Lake Tekapo, but it took us 10 years to do it. I went and saw Alan Hubbard to talk about options on where we go from there. I sort of had a tiger by the tail. He was excited, and we decided for me to get half a dozen farmers and he would get half a dozen businessmen to look at doing something substantial to get some certainty for South Canterbury future. The Opihi River Development Company was formed, and together with South Canterbury Farmers Irrigation Society and Alpine Energy joined up and clearly indicated that the South Canterbury community was right with us in pursuing our objective. A dam on the Opihi River was the best chance of achieving our goal. So that was our objective, and over 5 years later, we had a dam completed that had held 74 million cubic metres of stored water. This was the result of a huge investment of time and energy put in by a lot of people interested in making a more reliable and certain future for South Canterbury community from environmental enhancement and financial point of view. We have been operating the dam for nearly 22 years, and here a reliability of 95% for irrigation, irrigators who have paid for water charges and for the construction of the whole project, which was $30 million, of which the government of the day paying $3 million for some of the costs of the environmental enhancements. Changes like Stage 2 of Plan Change 7 and proposals undermines and devalues the lifetime investment some people put in on behalf of the whole community. I believe it compromises the ability of lake storage to be able to maintain environmental flows downstream too. It also reduces the reliability of irrigation water, which the scheme has over 22 years proved that a win for irrigation reliability is really a fact. My view is that these proposed changes are a real underarm bowl, and I would like to see them withdrawn forthwith. The experience I've had so far in getting the dam built and managing the operation has convinced me that local people making local decisions is appropriate. The OFRAG has assisted in making that representatives from all of the South Canterbury community locally assisted in making decisions strategy-wise on releases from the dam in the last 15 years. This has been totally effective and useful in making those decisions on the releases to achieve the most efficient outcome for making the best use of what water is available in the lake. Every year is different, and local people that make up that team have proved the value over those years. And I would like to say the lake storage and management has achieved the outcomes we envisaged 25 years ago, proved by the fact that 2 trophies for winning ECAN competitions, one for environmental enhancements and the other for commercial events, we had and won them both, and the judges were most impressed with what we'd done for up in that area. I believe this is evidence that no change is needed, and OFRAG should be retained like it is with local decision making. And that, I believe, of those 22 years of operation, it's been going really well under great management, and the efficiencies that have come into the irrigation systems now make it important to not change it. And I would like to point out that if it's going well, don't change it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Henderson. Your decades of community service make it entirely appropriate that you should come and tell us what you've been telling us, your views about what should be done. Thank you very much. Now, we may have one or two questions for you. I hope you're willing to allow us to ask them if there are any. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Mr. Henderson?
No, no questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, no questions from me either.
Well, Mr. Henderson, you can see that you've explained yourself so clearly that there's no questions that we need to ask of you. And may I again thank you for coming. Thank you for reminding us of the value of the history book that you referred to. And thank you for your own account and summary of what's gone on in the development of the dam and the value that it has given to the whole community. Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bell.
Good afternoon.
It's a pleasure to have you here again.
Thank you.
And we have the submission that you put in, and you've carefully gone through and given us detailed accounts of the definitions of the amendments that you are proposing. And all set?
Yes, sorry.
We've got your submission there very clearly.
Yep.
And now's your opportunity to speak to it just as you wish.
Thank you very much. Yesterday I spoke on behalf of FORP. Today I speak as an individual. So I'm a second generation farmer on our farm, which was farmed by my parents, who bought the farm in 1954, and now my wife Bev and myself for the last 40 years have farmed this property. Though the last two, it was in my previous submission, I have actually leased part of, or most of it, and so I'm no longer irrigating. The water was leased as well. I still farm 50 hectares, so I'm a toy farmer, I call myself. So we raised my siblings, 5 siblings were raised on the farm, and now my wife and I have raised our 4 children there who have left home, married, had children. So we see ourselves as guardians of our land, and when we finish our journey here, we hope to pass on our farm to future generations in a way that is left for them to nurture and leave it in better condition than we began. It would be fair to say that I've been pretty passionate about farming and the environment. We live adjoining the Opihi River. We look from our house into the Opihi Gorge. I'm the chair of the subcommittee of the Fairley Lines that looks after the walking and cycle tracks adjacent to the Opihi River, going from the gorge to Stoneley Road, which is approximately 22 kilometres in length. Also been leading the reopening of the walkway through the Opihi Gorge that traverses the length of the gorge from the bottom of our property, goes through the bottom of our property and comes out at Rockwood. I love our area. It's our playground. We enjoy being able to swim in it, the gorge, cycle the tracks. We play, we swim, we drink the water. It would be fair to say I'm pretty passionate about it, and we would call it our patch, which I love people enjoying and using. It's part of our joint heritage to look after it, to continue to do so for the future generations, including our grandchildren who have loved swimming in it in this last summer. We'd love to see our area enhanced with a corridor of Indigenous planting from the gorge to Stoneleigh Road. We have had conversations with ECAN on this, the catchment group more recently, who are talking of a collective agreement to sort of bring in the South Canterbury catchments and perhaps be a vehicle to seek funding for enhancing our waterways. So it's out there. It hasn't happened yet. I've actually brought a photo that my wife took yesterday, and it most probably, it's not a very good photo because it shows a overgrown old man's beard taking over the margins of a river. And it would be fair to say ECAN don't particularly see the margins as their issue, but I would love to think that they will be active in the space and catchment groups could be active in the space. And I'd love to see a corridor of Indigenous native plantings join our river. Obviously, within the Opihi Gorge, we have lovely natives flourishing for basically the full length of it now, some sycamore trees in places. But hopefully 10 years, you may not be in the chair that you are now, but I'd like to think you would be able to observe, as I would, that that may be part of our conversation and our improvements going forward. That's just background. Sorry, I'm wobbling, but this carries on to this. Sorry, I've left of it. In my submission for FORP yesterday, I did talk about the DIN levels being above recommended levels during winter, and that was supported by Dr. Greg Ryder's information and water testing. There is continued work programmed in this current season to identify the source, but what I have a problem is that the landing the Fairlie Basin in a high nitrate area, which perhaps accounts for a very small area of the basin emitting. And so the data, I believe, that has led ECAN to label Fairlie Basin as a high nitrate zone comes from Wells and Ashwick and Sheridan. This is certainly not the whole basin. So let's identify the source, remedy the issue. We know Taylor Stream has a high nitrogen content which draws from Ashwick Flat. I don't like being labelled as a high nitrogen emitter. We see farmers, dairy farmers in particular in the Ashwick Flat, are cutting nitrogen applications. Perhaps more is needed. Ashwick stock water races, which also feed the stream, Ashwick water races that feed the stream. This is currently being looked at in relation to piping this stock water. This should eliminate a potential source of nitrogen that feeds Taylor Stream. And I should note that dairy farmers are all fenced off, so it's not dairy farmers that are sort of lending any stock inclusion into those water races, but it is a fact that they do, they've been fenced off, but they do come through their property. So this is currently being looked at. So what I would ask is, please don't label the whole of our Fairlie Basin as high nitrogen. This is an area perhaps 25 kilometres long, 10 kilometres wide, and I don't believe it requires that label on it, but we would be certainly keen to identify sources and bring this into a pristine river. Adaptive management is the second note that I had. This has worked well for the environment and irrigators alike. You've already had the presentation from the working group, so perhaps I would add my perspective as an irrigator, in very trying conditions in 14-15, they had their ability to let water be used in the upper catchments while restricting the lower catchment, but obviously that gave us water in the early part of the season when we ran out later on. So in mid to late season we were completely shut off for 49 days and many more days restricted. So it wasn't something that we could control, but certainly we could mitigate it with the adaptive management regime, and so we appreciated how it worked. I again would say to the commissioners perhaps to focus on the outcomes of a successful adaptive management regime, not just the rules. I can see a two-step rules being inflexible and the continuing dynamics of understanding a season which can change in a day. If this adaptive management regime remain in a flexible regime so that water is maximised for the benefit of all. So I got my wife to take a picture this morning out of the front window, and I don't know if we can see that, but it shows the snow cap currently on the mountains in front of our farm, but can you see that, Commissioner?
Yes,
I can leave it here, but basically it shows Fox's Peak and a very low snowcap for the beginning of November. We would perhaps expect to see that at the end of November. That is where the flexibility of something that recognises something happening on the ground in real time is perhaps more appropriate than a two-step rule that says we will start restriction at that stage. So from a personal point of view, that was what I'd like to add at that stage. Number 3, I have spoken in support of Table 4 yesterday and opposed Table 14Q on the FORP recommendation. There is some things that could be reiterated. First, I'd like to speak to Table 2P and how pro-rata block would affect reliability. I believe we've addressed the water quality issue with Dr. Ryder's evidence, and as I mentioned, the farm environment plans being implemented will see some ongoing improvements in water quality. As Mr. Stone presented a couple of weeks ago, perhaps from a different viewpoint, but he also recognised the quality flowing out of the Opihi above the junction of Opura, and I think his words was pristine or very good fish habitat full of invertebrates. So I believe we have a quality river. We can continue to improve it. So what I'd like to point out with the table and pro rata restrictions is for the last 21 years we've had a pro rata block of 120 litres, a second setting in restrictions at a level of 910 litres, shutting off at 790. With the restrictions proposed in 14P, we have a pro rata block of 474, so that's the sum of all consented abstractions. There's a consented abstraction there of about 100 litres that is consented but has not got shares and is not used. But I think that's where we fell, 474. So basically restricted above MALF, so 474 on top of the 850 litres, where we finish water abstractions completely, gives us a 1324 litre a second, which is above the MALF area where we restricted down to 850. Table 14Q, 1,000 litres a second with pro rata set at 474, basically meaning we're restricted well above MALF. And the shoulders of the season, that shifts to 1,500, so we're just under 2 QMX where we are being restricted. So despite the water that we've paid for being released to replenish our takes 10 to 15k down. I don't believe the tables of 14Q have taken into account the extra waters released to replenish our takes and the extra water flowing down the Opure main stem to Raincliff where the Opihi joins. And reliability on this past season, so those two graphs were attached to my evidence on Fort, but we would have seen the status quo 18-19 being 98%, and the step 2 we would have seen it at 76%. Last year it would have been status quo 90% going down to 68%, so it is quite a drop in reliability. So past 2 seasons now, I would consider 18-19 was a pretty kind summer. It wasn't difficult, and there wasn't lots of, I think about 3% of the days were totally stopped from irrigating. The rest were on limited abstraction. Am I going all right? You still with me? What I'd like to point out with the tables, sorry, I've already read that. So the difference between table P and table Q is 150 litres a second, but it's an enormous effect on the viability for irrigators. The effect of the difference would have been 24 days without any water in this past season between P and Q. So you can see that it is a substantial effect for 150 litres of water, although there have and would have been some partial restrictions. In 18-19 we had a relatively kind summer, but we would still see the difference of something like 22% for both seasons from full availability to restriction. I trust this makes it clear that why it is critical for reliability and sustainability. When we can only hope to have 70% reliability, it makes a bit of a mockery of having irrigation. It's a bit like putting on weight on a broken leg. I've farmed long enough to know the stresses that dry and drought can bring, both mentally, emotionally and physically, and so I would again urge you to look at deleting 14Q and perhaps review this in 10 years' time. Well, I know you have provisions to do so, so I'd love to see that affected. My last point was the definition of pro rata. So essentially in the Fairlie Basin we have most people affiliated to Opure Water. We have 2 or 3 small shares and 2 30 litre a second shares that are called AN, which means they have no shareholding in the dam itself. They were prior to 95, I think, would define an A, but the farmer at the time decided he would sell his shares and buy property instead. So the end result, they are sitting there AN. We believe they most probably should be down the order somewhat of the reliability as against those that pay. Thank you very much, and I hope that helps with your decision making.
Well, Mr. Bill, you've given great satisfaction to us with all of your experience, and I'll just see if my colleagues would like to ask any questions before we let you go. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, you talked about adaptive management and, in your view, the need for flexibility, and you said that you saw the 2-step rule as being quite restrictive. And you may be aware from the questions that we've been asking, there's sort of 2 options before us. One is to include, this is in terms of moving away from full availability flows down to level 1 or 2. There's 2 options. That's to have the inflows, snow storage and lake level triggers embedded in the plan, and there's disagreement between the experts on what those numbers should be. The other option would be to have all of that detail contained in, say, a management plan and to be dealt with through a resource consent process. Do you have a preference?
Without fully understanding the applications that each would deal with, I understand it is very hard for a rule writer to be prescriptive when we are dealing with a very dynamic and fluid situation. I would hate to be writing the rule to do it, and I would love to think that there could be some guidelines within that framework that would guide, but as we saw in 14-15, they got down to 0% storage, but still managed to remain connectivity in the stream itself. And so it was a long-term picture. It was obviously a pretty fluid situation, and one rain can make the difference. So I haven't answered your question because I'm not fully sure of all the details that either would entail, but I think you sort of understand my drift is that I don't envy the rule writer, but I would like to think that there'd be some guidelines that would be flexible to recognise that.
No, I understand that. So your preference would be for flexible guidelines as opposed to very prescriptive, locked-in stuff and triggers. Yeah, okay. No, that's good. Thank you. That was all. Thanks.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I don't have any questions, thank you.
Mr. Bill, you've had long experience with your farm and with your family. You might even say you're semi-retired, I suppose, but when you consider that you're continuing community service in the ways you've been describing, practical ways, and considering practical ways of reducing the nitrates in the fresh water, you've made 2 visits to us. You're unstinting in the advice that you're offering us. We're very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity.
Is this Mr. Kelly?
Yep.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kelly. Thank you for coming in. You're representing Raumea Farms and Maize Pastures, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And we have your submission here, and we're expecting to hear from you about it, and you can speak to it just as you would like, and you can start when you're feeling ready.
Sure. Firstly, thanks for your time. Belinda and I, we farm together out at Present Point with Raumea Farms and in conjunction with another guy, Hamish Munro at Maize Pastures. We all love the outdoors, we love the water, and we love farming. We feel a huge responsibility to the environment, and we really hope that we are farming to this. Today should be pretty brief. I'll just give you a quick background of where we've come from, a quick brief on the dairying that we've been in for the last 8 years, and then thirdly just finish off with my concern to the end loss calculation that's stipulated. So we started farming in 2003, we got irrigation in 2008. In 2012 we made the call to go dairying for a few different reasons, and we're probably lucky at that stage that we had 2 options. We could go low cost, low input, low stocking rate, or we could go high stocking rate, high input. And Lincoln University were doing some research around that time which suggests that there was not a lot of difference in profitability on the average payout. So we chose the lower because we felt it was a sort of a no-brainer. It was better for the environment. We could stay profitable, and it was really where we felt we wanted to head. I'd just like to stipulate that it was quite against the trend. We had consultants telling us, what are you doing? You need to put more in. So over the last 4 to 5 years, we have been, not so much the last 4 to 5 years, but that early times we were definitely going against the grain. So with that, with Raumea Farms, our first farm, we were sort of sitting in around the 35 to it's sort of around that 35-40 loss in nitrogen, and moving along nicely there, both profitability and in terms of how we felt it with farming. In 2016, we purchased another property, 120 hectares. We took that over. It had a nitrogen leaching of 68. Overnight, we brought that back to 35. So we're running 1,300 cows, 360 hectares, and felt that we're sort of sitting at a nice spot of 35 to 40 kgs of nitrogen loss. So that's the background of where we've been going. We felt as though this was coming, and we needed to be part of it, and then we needed to be profitable, and we needed to be proactive. The concern with your in-loss calculation, as we've said in here, is we're still well below what GMP is going to be. Around that 35 versus probably 49. So if someone's leaching now at 68, they will come back to GMP of around 48 to 49, less 10%. They will be able to work in a vicinity of 44 to 45 kgs of nitrogen loss. In our scenario where we've been proactive and we've been doing this for 6 to 8 years at 35, we've still got to take 10% off that 35, which brings us back to 31.5. I just don't feel that's very fair for what we've been doing. Someone who's been up here and doing it for a long time, we've been proactive, and they're going to be sitting on 44.5, and we'll be down at 31.5. Belinda and I and Hamish, we know we've got to be lower. We've got plans, we've got irrigation plans, we've got a big capital input we've got to do in the next wee while, and we'll do that, and we'll continue to bring it down. But to me, I just feel it's not a level playing field for those that have been working proactively towards it. And you've got the solution in there in terms of the wording that we think should be written. So that's me.
Well, it's particularly useful to have somebody from a different section of the industry to have your point of view as well. And it's particularly useful also that you come with some practical suggestions based on the experience that you've actually gone through over the last decade. Do you have any questions for Mr. Kelly, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, but certainly understand the issue you're raising about farmers who are already operating below GMP in terms of the starting point and further reductions. So yeah, it's certainly an issue that we're aware of, so we'll be giving that some thought.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I do have one question at your paragraph 20, Mr. Kerr. I acknowledge that you are trying to and are farming environmentally responsible, evident in being awarded an A in your FEP audit for Raumea Farms, and that you put much thought and research into properties and how they will be used before and after you purchase them, as noted in paragraph 8 above. So I wonder what you considered before you purchased Mazed Pastures, knowing that it had a high stocking rate and a high nitrogen input that resulted in a high nitrogen baseline, that leaves you now asking the panel to reconsider or consider rewording policy 14.4.20b.
Hopefully I understand that question well, like when we bought maize, we knew we could bring it back to 35
Yes.
and work profitably and bring the environment back. So I guess I know the industry, if we get things right, can do the same. But I just feel that the ones that have already done it, to lower it even more so, is probably where I've got the concern. I've got no concern about the industry bringing it back. Is that sort of where you're going with the question, or?
Well, I acknowledge that you brought it back quite a bit overnight, but knowing that it already had a high nitrogen baseline, I just wondered what your thinking was. I suppose because you knew you could bring it back somewhat.
To be honest, I didn't know what the baseline was.
Right.
Until we done our first.
Okay.
I knew it was high input because I can see what's happening over the fence.
Yeah.
It's not how we farm, so all I looked at is how we were going to farm it.
Mm.
But what concerned me when I did see it is that's where it was, and how that can happen.
Right.
And I was down here. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I presumed you would know what the high nitrogen baseline was.
I think now if I was buying a farm, I definitely would.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
back in 2016,
Yeah.
there was a few other dynamics going on. But
No, thank you, Mr. Kerr. You've explained yourself.
thank you. Thanks for your time.
So you were far-sighted, Mr. Kelly,
Sorry.
when you were describing your experience. I think it's fair to say that you were far-sighted in respect of the air loss that would result if you put more animals on and put more fertiliser on, and you've made deliberate decisions, and I hope you're getting the reward of them, and hope you can continue to. It's been very valuable to us to have you come in and give us your experience, and thank you very much for doing so.
Thank you.
Is it Mr. Howie?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Howie, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you very much for coming in. We have your submission, and it's interesting that you're going to be able to talk to us about that. And although we've read the submission itself, of course, you come in and we want to listen to what you'd like to say to us about it.
Thank you, Commissioner, and kia ora. So I'm representing two organisations. Firstly, our own business, Viberi New Zealand Limited, and Meadowlinks Residents Association, in regards, particularly in regards to the bore stream depletion effects of existing bores. I'd also want to declare some interests that I'm involved in other organisations, so it's clear. On the board of Horticulture New Zealand, but I'm not representing that board. I'm also chair of NZGAP, which is a compliance regulation organisation that most horticultural entities have their compliance programs through. I'm currently a director of Seedlands, a director of Farmers Mill. Currently we farm 85 hectares of organic blackcurrants, and we also own and lease out another 108 hectares on the Levels Plain. Past affiliations include being a director and founder of Southern Packers. I was also a past director of Ravensdown of Apua Water from the inception of that, when that organisation started the dam, and past president of the South Canterbury Chamber of Commerce. Also been involved with a long time ago in the Department of Maori Affairs, and also as a trustee of the Te Aotearoa Horticultural Council in Timaru. So just in terms of a bit of a preamble, I don't intend to read through my submission because I know you've got it in front of you, but just in regards to the economic benefits of irrigation in the Pua Dam to South Canterbury, and I've mentioned about the Harris report, which was written in 2006, which is probably a little bit dated now. But just in terms of where we're at with agriculture and the significance of agriculture to the South Canterbury, I'd perhaps like to update a little bit from that report, and that in the Infometrics June 20 report, it's very clear that in this region, agriculture and manufacturing, manufacturing in South Canterbury mainly means food processing, accounts for 28.9% of GDP compared to 14.9% for the rest of New Zealand. So it gives a bit of a background to the importance of agriculture to this region. It's very, very significant. And it's not just as significant in terms of economic contribution to GDP for the area, but it's also, when you look at the statistics for employment, it's also very similar. The amount of people that are employed in agriculture and agricultural processing in South Canterbury is very significant. So I guess the point with this is that agriculture and agricultural processing is the backbone of our local economy, and particularly around employment as well. And the potential for growth is potentially likely to be in those areas. And I just urge the commissioners to consider this when looking at the new plan, and make sure that this region allows for growth, particularly around horticultural crops. So just in regards to my submission around the Apua flow regime changes, I wanted to reiterate that if possible, that the rules on reliability for irrigation shouldn't change through the term of the consent, as this would set a precedent and discourage future infrastructure investments. And I understand that from the proposed that OFRAG isn't to remain, but I would urge that either that remains or something similar that allows flexibility and community consultation be incorporated into the plan. With regards to high nitrogen concentration areas, and once again I won't read my submission, but my concern is that impossible targets could be adopted, as groundwater entering the levels area is often at elevated levels, way beyond the 5.5 target level. And potentially with these targets, it could make farming actually impossible in the levels plain if we were to adopt those targets. And the reason I know that is that the water that comes into the levels plain area is right at where my farm is, where the black currants is, and we've been measuring those levels for many years, so we know what the groundwater levels are at that point. So just regarding the bore stream depletion effects on existing bores, and this is relevant for both Viberi, a business, and for the Meadowlinks Residents Association that also has a bore in that area. So I believe that changing the 30-day test regime to a 150-day test regime, while I understand that's common throughout the rest of Canterbury, it was really in the fine print of the documents, and it took a lot of investigation to actually realise that the rules were going to change, because it wasn't very evident in the documents that came out. And I make a slight change to my my submission, that I said that it wasn't mentioned in the Section 32 report. I actually realise now that it was, but it was very.
Notice.
Sorry.
You didn't notice it. Yes, I understand why.
Yeah, but even that it is mentioned, it doesn't really discuss in detail what the effect of that will be in any sort of detail. So it is, while it mentions that it'll have an effect on some abstractors. Potentially, for some abstractors, it will make the difference between having an irrigated property and not having an irrigated property. So it'll be extremely influential on some abstractors. And it could affect our bores, particularly the bore for Meadowlinks Residents Association, which is partly domestic and partly for irrigation. And then there's the last part of my submission is around the capping of the groundwater takes, and I'll take that as read.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so
We
happy to take any
have it
questions.
on read as you've been addressing it. Thank you. Yes. Any questions, Commissioner Van Dorsen?
Yes, you just mentioned that you've been monitoring the groundwater on your farm. Can you just remind me how deep your bore is and what the groundwater nitrate, nitrogen concentrations have tended to be in your measurements?
So the groundwater, this is at Butler's Road, near the golf course.
Yeah.
The groundwater often is in that 3 to 4 metres below ground level, so it's quite shallow.
Yeah.
And those levels have often ranged from about 7 and almost got up to 10, I think, at one stage.
Right. Yeah.
So, but I've never seen them down as low, but below 6. I don't think I've ever seen them below 6.
Yep. Okay, no, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have one question. And on a personal note, I commend you for growing organically. I like organic food, and especially love the black currants. Under the paragraph titled Historical Context of the Opihi Dam, the second sentence of that paragraph where it begins, when the scheme was promoted to farmers, it was on the basis that farmers and other commercial investors would fund the dam in its entirety, even though over 10 million of the cost of the project related to non-commercial, environmental, cultural and recreational benefits. What was the cultural benefits? Can you explain what was intended to be culturally beneficial?
As I recall, at the time that the dam was promoted, Peter Elworthy was the chair of the dam company at that stage, and he consulted widely with our whenua. And the main cultural benefits was to allow the minimum flow regime in the river to remain. As you may recall, and I think past submitters, particularly Tom Henderson, reported that the river would often go completely dry.
Yes.
So in no time, even though it's come close, in no time since the building of the dam has the river stopped flowing. So from my perspective and my limited understanding of the cultural benefits to Māori, is that the fact that the river could continue to flow and that the fish could still remain remain viable, all but under stress, but they still could remain, as opposed to the fish rescues that used to have to take place before the dam was built, was a dramatic improvement to what it was before.
No.
Still not perfect. I'm not saying it's perfect now,
No,
but it was a dramatic improvement on what it was.
Well, actually, thank you for explaining that. To me, it's taken me a while to find that out, so thank you.
Mr. Howie, the black currants is the major part of your enterprise, isn't it?
That's right.
Are there other major black currant producers in South Canterbury, or are you standing out on your own?
We're the only organic producers in South Canterbury. There's at least 2 or 3 other blackcurrant producers, but blackcurrants are, and even not growing them organically is environmentally very benign. So, you know, the nitrate leaching even for conventional blackcurrants is probably less than 20, and for our operation, it's in single digits.
Yes, and Is it increasing? You got increasing demand?
Yeah, we've got our own branded product, which is Viberi in the
Yes.
marketplace. So, yes, it's a challenge though, but yeah, we're getting there. So it's the long-term future, I think, is
Yes.
some of these very healthy crops.
Well, we can see that when somebody like you, with your breadth of experience that you've described, can come in and explain it to us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Appreciate your help. Is Mr. Hart here? Mr. Reese Hart? Good afternoon, Mr. Hart.
Good afternoon, Judge Shepherd, and good afternoon to the commissioners. Thank you for being here and hearing our submissions.
We do have your submission, and we looked through it, and we're ready to listen to you speak to it just as you would like.
Right, thank you. I'm probably, with the exception of Tom Henderson, a bit different from most in that I'm old enough to know what the river was like before it was modified. As you can see in my submissions, I've lived beside the river for 54 years. I don't live there now. I'm semi-retired. I live on an irrigated block at Levels, and I'm a shareholder in Opihi Water Limited. I've had experience in the agribusiness sector in a number of areas, breed societies, wool marketing groups, and I was chairman of Silver Fern Farms. It was a company that employed 7,000 people and turned over $2.5 billion. So these days my son farms Palm Hills and Pigeon Cliffs. Those two properties are adjacent to the Opihi River, just below the Hanging Rock Bridge. I'd have to point out that they are not irrigated properties, they're hill country properties running livestock. And just to give you a bit of background of the properties themselves, we are the third European owner of Palm Hills. My grandfather bought the property in 1907, and it's very interesting to look at the heritage of the area prior to that, the early settlers. It's an interesting area. It comprises a series of limestone ridges running east to west, high cliffs, a lot of caves, and a lot of rock art. A lot of academics have looked at the rock art, and I suppose there's no real agreement, but they do think that the rock art's about 500 years old, and some would say it was done by the Maoris, others would say it was pre-Maori times. I've got no opinion because I simply don't know. But it's very easy to understand why this area was settled in the early days. It was very abundant with food supplies. There was a lot of native forest, swamps. The Opihi River itself was blessed with good supplies of eel. And of course the Maori in those days used to round up the moa on the flats and drive them into the gullies. The gullies had swamps. They were lined with native bush. They would capture the moa, and they were an important part of their food supply. They cured the skins and used the feathers for their clothing. So the area had moa, wood pigeons and tui. The wood pigeons and the tui are coming back again. Peka peka, the native long-tailed bat. As I've said, eels and pukekos. Since then, we've had a lot of introduced species, not all good. Rabbits, hares, trout, salmon, pheasants. There's a range of European and North American bird life. Now, I've got some photos here. I can send them through to you electronically, but they are taken standing on top of Pigeon Cliffs, looking at the Opihi River, looking west to the Hanging Rock Bridge, and looking east to Pleasant Point. You will see that there's quite an area of native bush bounding the Opihi River. Ngāi Tahu has an interest in that. We look after it. We love the native bush, and in fact the area, it's very special, and we intend to keep it that way if possible. So you probably think, I'm getting a bit off the track here. What's this got to do with Plan Change 7? Well, I think it's got everything to do with it, because throughout my life living beside the river, and I'm talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, I and my friends and family spent a lot of time there, fishing, camping, climbing the rocks, and it was just a wonderful existence. But I'm very sorry to say the river was dying. The river on unmodified form at that stage, which was before dairying, before irrigation, and certainly before the dam was constructed, was so unreliable. As you can see in my submissions, about 4 years out of 10, the river would either dry up or come very close to it. It was quite common to see front page articles in the Timaru Herald of the Acclimatisation Society rescuing fish from the pools that were left that were rapidly drying out. One of the side effects of that, of course, there was no complaints about algae. If the river was dry and the hot sun bearing down on the hot baked stones, there was no chance of that. There's no algae in it at the moment, incidentally, because I went down and had a good look this last week. But to get to the point, my concern is about the viability of irrigation for farmers, and so the viability of the dam, Apua Water Limited. And as I'll describe to you in a minute, and I want to make mention of Leonie Gaine's submissions here last week about the tipping point. If the minimum flows are raised when we need the water the most, over 3, possibly 4 months, it could well make the prospect of irrigating non-viable for us. And so that in turn would put the viability of the dam under threat. It's interesting, if we had no water, there'd be nothing to argue about. There'd be no point in this hearing either. To put it bluntly, the farmers built and paid for this dam. And when they did it, they brought the river back to life. Now, by that I mean, I've got 2 more photographs here. These were taken last week, 6 days ago. That's me standing in the mainstream just above the Pleasant Point bridge. Now, and that's not all the flow, there's another tributary coming in just below me. That never existed when the river was unmodified. And in fact, I could take the same photo in the same place and I'd be standing on a dry riverbed. So this dam is a precious asset for the benefit of all of South Canterbury. Without the dam, we wouldn't have this wonderful minimum flow. And incidentally, the water 6 days ago that I was standing in was so pure and so fast flowing. I could swim in it, I could drink in it, my grandchildren could, my pets could. I think the quality was excellent without doing a scientific sample. I'd just like to make it clear that we don't own the water, and we don't think we do, but we do own the dam that puts the water in the river. And we're all familiar when the snowpacks melt and the water comes down through the system. We simply store it to use it in times of stress. It's ironic, isn't it, that the farmers who paid for the dam and shared it with the various community groups at no cost to those groups are now at risk because some of them want more. They want to raise the minimum flows above these levels that I've just showed you. I think it's outrageous, to be honest. I think it's just absolute greed. And when you consider the damage that it may well do if these minimum flows are raised again, we get to the point that Leonie Guiney made, the tipping point. And we're not that far away from the tipping point. It's all very well saying to farmers, we'll give you plenty of water over the winter or some other time. We actually need it during the peak growing times. In other words, going into summer, through summer, and probably going into the autumn to set ourselves up for the winter. So if you say to farmers, oh, we'll only raise the minimum flows 10 or 20%, it's hardly much at all. It can be the difference, as Leonie said, between milking a full season or drying the cows off 4 months early. Now, I'm not a dairy farmer, I'm a bull beef farmer, and the same effects would be felt by us. So here's my worry. If it becomes uneconomic for me to continue irrigating because minimum flows have been lifted at a crucial time in my farming operation, presumably everyone else will be the same that are irrigating, and it will no longer be viable for them to be carrying on with shares in a Pearl Water and paying the water charges. That, of course, puts pressure on the company, and we can only guess as to what would happen at that point. The dam is very expensive to run and maintain, and we're doing it because we're profitable and we can pay to do this. The river needs the dam desperately to provide those flows. Without it, we go back to what we had, which would be an absolute disaster. So what does it mean for the region? Well, a lot of people have spoken about this, and I've mentioned it too, but I would say to you commissioners, you're sitting here day after day and you could probably do with a bit of fresh air and a bit of exercise. What you should do is get someone to take you down to Partiti Point. It's not far from here, and there's a 15-minute walk up South Beach. It's a really nice walk, a good track. You can walk up there, and to your right you've got the beach and the ocean. To your left you've got a massive shed which is leased by Fonterra. You can count hundreds, possibly thousands of containers. They're being assembled, they're being loaded, they're being repaired. And when you finish that walk, go to the top of the Bay Hill and stand on the top of the piazza and look over the port here and look out to sea. At any time, you can see a container ship unloading or loading in the port of Timaru. You can usually see another 2 ships waiting to come in. This drives South Canterbury. It is all driven off the back of water. There is no question about that. So if we fiddle around with minimum flows and just crib a bit here and a bit there from farmers to the point that it wrecks the viability of the scheme, we wreck the viability of this region. Now, to conclude, enough's probably been said about off-rag already. I'm a great supporter of it. And I just point out that the trends throughout the world are towards centralisation. The brutal communist dictatorships love it. Doesn't always work too well, but there's a trend in westernised societies to go towards centralisation as well. So politicians, both national and local body politicians, talk about governance of the people, by the people, for the people. But the reality is they haven't got any intention of that. They want to take the decision-making away from people if they possibly can. And this is a prime example. A councillor, an ECAN councillor, said, we must get rid of ECAN because nowhere else in the country does this system operate. So in fairness to everyone, we have to run it from an office of ECAN, and off-rag won't be needed. I couldn't disagree more. I think local people and local groups, particularly the ones involved in this catchment area, are the ones who are best equipped to manage it. If you look at the 22 years that the river's been, or the dam has been built, this off-rag group has micromanaged the river and the catchment area superbly. Now, as a farmer, I haven't always been pleased with the decisions they've made. And a number of times, my irrigation has been cut back because of decisions that off-rag has made. But I don't complain about it, and I don't hear any other farmers complaining about it either. Because, quite simply, everyone is doing their bit. We're all taking a cut for the good of the river. I think uppermost in our minds is the health of this river. And that's the whole basis of my submission. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hart. There may be 1 or 2 questions. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Mr. Hart?
Yes, just you've just talked a lot about minimum flows. I take it from your submission you're referring to the minimum flow regime at CLWR's Bridge on the...
Yes, I am. Yes.
And you say in your submission you support Opua Water Limited's submission. They in turn support the full availability flow proposed by the Adaptive Management Working Group. So I presume you also support that minimum flow regime for CLWR's Bridge?
Yes, that's what I was talking about. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that, so thank you.
Right.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I now have no questions.
Okay.
Well, Mr. Hart, you've brought generations of experience to prepare to explain to us what you've been telling us about. You've observed quite a lot of changes in the river, and your local knowledge is entirely relevant to informing the decision making that we're a part of. So thank you very much for coming in. Thank you for the forethought. Thank you for the photographs, and thank you for your submission or knowledge.
Thank you for your time.
And are you able to leave the big bit of cardboard with the pictures on it there so we can have a
Yes.
look at that?
I can do.
Thank you.
It's fine.
Good afternoon and welcome again, Mr. Hawkins. I think you've a double role this afternoon, have you?
Yes, I have, Commissioner, thank you.
And so you're speaking for yourself and for the AnaWai Water User Group, is that right?
That's correct, actually triple, because I'm also picking up on the Flow and Allocation Working Party that I was meant to speak to a couple of days ago when the dates were changed, but I couldn't make that because I was away for business. So I'm going to start, with your permission, with the Flow and Allocation Working Party, which was submitter number 382, and then move on to the AnaWai Water User Group, submitter number 68, and on my own family's submission at 97.
Yes.
But don't worry, I won't be speaking in triplicate.
Yes, we're comfortable with you presenting each of those together or separately, however it appeals to you.
Well, good afternoon, and Commissioners, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to my submission on Plan Change 7, and thank you for also allowing me to speak to the FORP part of that as well. I'll start with the FORP and then move on to the AnaWai Water User Group and then my own family submission. They all have slightly differing points. I've been a member of the FORP committee since late 2017. The FORP was the only process available through Plan Change 7 where we were all able to sit around the table with other interested parties or affected parties and work through the various issues and expert advice and reach a consensus. The FORP's proposals for minimum flow increases in the AnaWai at 2025 were based upon expert advice that these flows were required to meet ecological needs. We reluctantly agreed to the pro rata restrictions to take effect from 2035 after the Zone Committee asked us to consider this further. The timeframes proposed by the FORP gave us time to prepare for the financial hit and the on-farm operational changes and provide the time needed to monitor and measure any ecological benefit of the first step before moving forwards with the second step. The last-minute change to the regime by the Zone Committee to bring the pro-rata restrictions forward to 2030 was hugely disappointing to us after the work that had gone into developing the FORP recommendations. The changes imposed by the Zone Committee were made without any consultation to the community. PC7 had significant financial implications for the AnaWai Water User Group members, for their farming businesses at both 2025 and 2030. In the AnaWai, all irrigated farms, and there's only 5 of us, other than the dairy farms with very low debt, will become unviable and we will all face significant drop in farm values. Irrigators must be given more time to prepare for the financial hit and the on-farm operational changes. The AnaWai Water User Group strongly opposes the proposals in PC7 and more so the officer's recommendations to bring forward the timing of the minimum flow increases and pro rata partial restrictions proposed by PC7. I'm sure you understand after all these many days that this is not a large North Island river with big flows that one may encounter somewhere between Wellington and Auckland. This is a small river. If you look at my submission, under my submitter 68 and 97 on page 9, there are some photographs there. It's a small river with a large catchment and very fluctuating flows. The photographs in my submission were taken after all irrigation had ceased and we were on full restriction. There was no irrigation taking place. Going through this process, it appears that those involved have been promoting a minimum flow that they are setting and then will remain in place. This is not the case. The reality is that the river passes relatively quickly through these zones. We're not setting a minimum flow that's going to sit there for the rest of the summer like a big river. It's just going to go straight through there in a few days. The changes proposed will have little effect on the environment, as you've already seen through Greg Ryder's evidence, but a massive effect on the families and communities involved. I would like to acknowledge the vastly improved working relationship with Fish and Game through FORP. In Mark Webb's evidence and response to a question from the Commissioners regarding bringing pro rata forward, he stated that increasing the minimum flows combined with pro rata will maintain connectivity. Can I please reiterate to the Commissioners that under the current regime, we already have connectivity for the length of the river when we are under full restriction and all irrigation has ceased. None of these proposals will change that. In my submission, I requested expert caucusing for the AnaWai. Under 55 in the proposed Plan Change 7, a flow of 450 litres a second will provide flow connectivity. As previously stated, this is misleading. This is already being achieved with a minimum flow of 400 litres a second. And you can see the work from Kerry Johnston and Greg Ryder through FORP for this. This matters. It makes a difference of many days' irrigation through the season, just when the irrigators need it. There was no one in the expert conference to consider the economic effect. I was disappointed with the expert conference on the hydrology of the AnaWai and drew the conclusion that there was little benefit to increasing minimum flows. Again, referring to Greg Ryder's work, between 479 litres and something like 1,100 litres, there was very little benefit to raising the minimum flow. The experts agree that increases in the AnaWai and the upper Opihi tributaries equate to some increase at Saleyards Bridge, but there is a difference in opinion between the experts as to the magnitude of this increase. What they haven't mentioned or considered is that at this point, i.e. the Saleyards Bridge, our obstructions are fully replaced by releases from the Opihi Dam. So now I'm going to move forward and speak on behalf of the AnaWai Water User Group and our own family. Our farm lies adjacent to the AnaWai River, downstream of Cave. We have a diverse farming operation of beef finishing with some small seed production, arable, deer and dairy support. We emigrated to New Zealand 19 years ago and have put our hearts and souls into the farm and the community. When we first arrived, we used to regularly go down to the river with our young children, aged 1, 5 and 7, and we just thought it was fantastic. We used to regularly go down there swimming, fishing, playing, and to have this on our boundary was a real privilege. We have 2 full-time and a number of part-time and casual staff. We hold an AA consent to abstract from an underground gallery on the AnaWai, having been part of the Opihi Dam since its inception. Excuse me. For the last 19 years, we've been operating under a minimum flow regime which was developed in consultation between ECAN, Fish and Game, ecological experts and the AnaWai Water User Group as part of the consent process. All of the consent holders had previously already held consents to irrigate, making us some of the longest irrigators in Canterbury. Importantly, the process that they went through recognised and accounted for the fact that that there are consent holders both above and below the minimum flow site. The current minimum flow regime developed for the AnaWai was done with specific reference to that river and its conditions, not the far-reaching national policy statements and national environmental standards developed in Wellington, which, whilst being aspirational, may not work in application. Whilst the national policy statement and national environmental standards are the tools in play, they are a very blunt instrument and ignore science and, in our case, specific solutions. The affiliation to the Opihi Dam is based upon the release of water from the dam down the main stem of the Opihi River, which offsets or compensates for our takes and their effects on the main stem flows. For 37 kilometres from the Opihi Dam to the confluence of the AnaWai and the Opihi River, the river and its ecology is benefiting from this offset. Can I draw your attention to the diagram on page 6 of my submission with submitted number 68 and 97, and that's showing the ecological gain and offset from the Opihi Dam. Have you got that available to you, or?
I'm looking at page 6 of your submission, and that's obviously not the document that you're referring to.
Right. Okay.
So
it is quite a crucial point that I would like you to consider, because no one else has. So,
well, please don't hesitate. Is this the evidence statement that you produced, or is it? It's not the original submission, is it?
no, I'm speaking to my submission, so I'm not reading it. So it's regarding my submission with the submitter number 68 and 97.
I'll get the other one up.
I don't know how these systems are working. If I show a picture here, can you see it?
Yes, of course. Yes, I can see that very clearly, and I have seen that before.
Yes.
Yes.
So-
Yes, I did see that when we read it when it came in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what that's
And
showing...
do feel free to speak to it now, and to hold it up again if there's something further you'd like to point out
Thank you.
on it.
So what we've been unable to engage with anybody is the fact that the irrigators on the AnaWai are shareholders in the dam, but our water gets released down the Opihi. And what this means is there's a section of about 6 kilometres. I'm the last irrigator between me and the Opihi, where that water is missing. But that water has all been released down the Opihi, and there's 37 kilometres between the dam and the confluence, and then of course further onto the sea. This process has ignored the AnaWai Water User Group being shareholders in Opihi Water, and has ignored the benefits that this brings to the OTOP zone, and it's captured the current regime as being normal, whereas in fact the current regime is fully augmented, and credit for this has not been given. As mentioned in my evidence, the members of the AnaWai Water User Group hold 310 shares in Opihi Water, which has a capital value of 2.48 million. We pay annual water costs of 61,000. So I feel that we're already doing our bit in terms of putting back and paying back what we use. Our being shareholders helps maintain flows in the main stem, meaning fish can retreat to the main stem during periods of low flows and repopulate the river when flows allow. Along with 4 other consent holders, we are part of the AnaWai Water User Group, which has been operating for over 20 years. This group was already set up before we moved to New Zealand, and they're a group of just 4 local farmers who've been terribly impressive in how they've worked together over this period to find solutions. The AnaWai Water User Group worked together during times of restriction to comply with our consents. We have led the way in Canterbury in terms of water metering, telemetry and water user group functioning. We're one of the oldest water user groups that exists. We watch the river every day. We know that when we go into full restriction, the river is still flowing along its entire length. Under the certainty of our current consent, our family have invested millions of dollars into our property in terms of irrigation infrastructure, water storage, an underground gallery, stock water reticulation, new staff housing, renovation of the homestead, fencing and planting, to name but a few. Plan Change 7 will completely change this. Under Mr Grant Porter's evidence, our farm is likely to become uneconomic. Farming values will significantly drop due to reduced water availability, which will severely compromise the ongoing viability of farms in the catchment. Our investment in the property will cease and discretionary spending will disappear. Capital values will be catastrophically impacted. The significant impact on capital values will have an effect on the farmers' debt to equity ratios with their bank and the viability of their businesses. The underpinning scientific principles of our current agricultural systems are in danger of being devalued by a quasi-consultative process, and there is very real danger that farming in South Canterbury will be severely impacted. The AnaWai Water User Group does not support the proposals in Plan Change 7 and the Office's recommendations to bring forward the pro rata restrictions to 2030 and 2025 respectively. What I haven't mentioned is the margins, which were mentioned earlier today. The margins for the AnaWai are full of gorse and willow. The average willow tree a large willow tree consumes between 400 and 450 litres of water a day. If you look at the size of the berm on the river, multiply it by the distance, and that's a massive use of water. Similarly, gorse adds to nitrification. On our property, we spray the gorse all the time. We don't have any on our property, but there's an awful lot just over the fence on the Ecan side. But thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions.
Well, thank you, Mr Hawkins. Thank you for coming in and giving us your local experience and explaining these serious concerns. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions to ask of Mr Hawkins?
Yes, just in your evidence for the AnaWai Water Users Group at para 7.3, you say that they supported the Flow and Allocation Working Party's proposal for the minimum flow increases at 2025, but I take it from your, or I guess a question, based on your verbal submission to us today, is that still the case or not?
Well, the process has changed because when we were in full support, we were talking about step 1. We're now not. We're talking about step 2 and pro rata. So whilst we supported step 1 because we felt we had to, we almost felt there was change for the sake of change, but we felt we had to support it, and we did. We can't support step 2 and pro rata.
So table 14R, which is the AnaWai Environmental Flow and Allocation Regime, do you support that table?
I don't have that in front of me, I'm afraid.
Can we get that? I just want to be crystal clear in my mind what the current position is, because it's not clear from your evidence
Okay.
joined together with your verbal presentation. Staff? So staff, is that table 14R is notified?
Yeah. So if this is step 1, is this correct?
I hope so.
Yeah. So if this is step 1, then yes.
Okay. All right. And the pro rata restrictions, you support them coming in at 2035, or is that correct?
Well, that's long enough away that we can review it and see how things are. But I mean, I have heard discussion about that being brought forward, which we would strongly be against.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've tried to stress it, but the current situation isn't like many rivers in Canterbury where there were no minimum flows. The situation we have at the moment is a considered situation that has been made with the approval of all parties.
Yep, I understand that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have one, I guess, a question at decision sort table on page 18, where you talk about providing more clarity to what tangata whenua values mean. And while I agree that cultural values, as stated, is in a very general way, rock art, mātaitai, protection area, wahitapu, wahitaunga, etc., I'm sure the aim of this policy is to trigger engagement with tangata whenua so that they can explain in detail what the specific cultural values are, to see if and what effects our proposal will have on their values, and where they may discuss potential mitigation methods if and where necessary with the proposer. Only they know what the specific details of their values are. I'm Ngāi Tahu, but I don't know what they are. So it's just about, that's why. It's a little bit like being asked about your farm. There are many farms throughout New Zealand, but the specifics of your own farm is only known by you and whom you choose to share that with. So that's why that's just a trigger. I agree with you, but you'll only find out the specifics when you consult with them. Just to let you know that.
Thank you.
That's all from me.
Mr. Hawkins, as you've seen while you've been here, as well as you've heard from others, we've been benefiting and satisfying with the variety of the circumstances that people who come forward have been able to tell us of. And so we, when it comes to making recommendations to Environment Canterbury, are able to do so with the benefit of what everybody's been telling us, including yourself, and in particular the serious concerns on important matters that you've been raising. So thank you very much for coming in and speaking and coping with speaking on behalf of 3 separate submitters.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so, Ms. Fernando, does that complete the business before us today?
That does.
Yes, that's it. All right. So we'll adjourn now and resume tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And I think Ben will start with Mr. Lambie.
Yes, that's correct.